Well, good afternoon, everybody, here and online. Welcome to our weekly seminar series at the Dahdaleh Institute for Global Health Research. My name is Syed Imran Ali. I'm a research fellow here and the lead of the Humanitarian Water Engineering Lab. Today, I'm really delighted to host Mr. Brian Waters, who's going to be joining us for today's seminar, entitled Decentralized Water Markets and Seasonality in Freetown, Sierra Leone. In this presentation, Brian is going to present some of the work he's done during his master's, which he's now aiming to build upon for his PhD research here at York University in the EUC, Environment and Urban Change Department. So I invited Brian to do the seminar because I thought it would be a great opportunity to convene the researchers who are working on water and global health issues affiliated with the Dahdaleh Institute and have an opportunity for scholarly exchange when Brian is setting out on his PhD research to help feed in and reflect and potentially guide and inform some of his work. So now, as part of our usual practice here at the seminar series, I would like to begin by offering an acknowledgement of the indigenous land that we are on. Again, this is a hybrid event, so our guests are on different territories. Please take time to give thanks and respect to the land on which you're currently living and working. Today, we're here on York University campus in Toronto. York University is situated on the traditional territory known as Tekaronto, and we acknowledge its current treaty holders, the Mississaugas and the Credit First Nation. We acknowledge that this is the traditional territory of many indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. This is sort of like a boilerplate acknowledgement that we hear at every event. One thing that I heard that was really great from colleagues at MSF was every time the acknowledgement is given, to offer a personal reflection on what we are doing or would like to do or want to see ourselves do to fulfill the obligations that are incumbent upon us as being treaty holders. So I would like to offer that today and say that what I'm trying to learn about is what it means to be a treaty person. It's not something that I ever learned about before. So I'm trying to understand what are the treaties in this area, and then what are the responsibilities incumbent upon us as being treaty people. I'm also trying to learn about ways we can engage and learn about indigenous communities in our communities from my own particular professional background and academic background, which is on water. So I've been engaging with First Nations and indigenous communities in the Canadian North and in Ontario to learn more about the challenges and opportunities around water and health in indigenous communities in Canada. And invite you all to also reflect on how we can actualize the commitments that are coming upon us as treaty people as well. Now, let me begin with the brief introduction for our speaker, Mr. Brian Waters. Brian received master's degrees in both urban planning and agricultural economics from the University of Illinois. Which campus?
Urbana-Champaign.
Urbana-Champaign, great school. Yeah. Where he graduated as a Fulbright scholar. He's currently pursuing his PhD in geography I said EUC is geography, my apologies, at York University, where he aims to conduct decolonial research on decentralized water sources throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the objective of his PhD research is to offer evidence-based guidance and strategies to organizations that are grappling with the question of water source ownership, control, and administration using participatory action research. Brian has led research and development projects in the areas of urban transportation, energy access, urban agriculture, poverty alleviation, and access to clean drinking water in the past. Now, in today's seminar, Brian is going to present some of the findings of his Fulbright research, studying two distinct water markets accessed by people living in informal settlements in Freetown, Sierra Leone. Now, through these community-based projects, Brian will share his analysis of water sources, which aims to better understand and improve how water resources management is done in emerging country contexts. So what I heard a new term recently, which is majority world, which I like better than global south. I guess it's something real, I think, in a way that global south doesn't. And as I mentioned, Brian is starting out in his PhD. So this work that he's going to present today is sort of foundational to his PhD work. And what I would like to do is to invite the participants today to offer reactions to the work they hear today, which may help inform what Brian will work on for his PhD work and his trajectory and his academic research going forward. So this is a 1 hour event. We'll end promptly at 2 p.m. We'll start with a 25-minute presentation from Brian, followed by a 30-minute Q&A period and discussion. And we will wrap up and conclude at 2 p.m. So that was a very, very rapid fire introduction. I've talked very fast and I will stop talking now. Brian, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand for this presentation, just to move around, bring a little energy to it. I wanted to start off by thanking everybody for coming online, but also all of the friendly faces that are here in person. Those of you who are here, you can see a couple of pieces of paper in front of you. While we present research, the similar research on just one of the communities, we have papers here that show that a lot of research from the production side from about 8 or 12 communities here. So that's what those are for. But yeah, my name is Brian Waters, and I'll be presenting on decentralized water markets and seasonality in Freetown, Sierra Leone. Oh, and most importantly, I almost forgot to mention, thank you very much to Emran and the Dahdaleh Institute for hosting this and giving me this opportunity to present my research, especially at such a preliminary stage. So, get this technology. Okay. So, see what, whatever. So luckily I was going to present some groundwork, but everyone already took care of all of that. So we'll move right on to my research journey. There we go. Now it's all working. I wanted to go about this a little bit more narrative and factual for the reasons that we've already talked about so far, but don't worry, we will get to some findings and some data near the end. So the first thing I want to say is that what is my master's question? I had some really good, I started off looking into questions about willingness to pay in my research because of my agriculture econ background and trying to find some economic measures of what's going on. But in reality, when I got what really inspired me, despite that methodology and the theoretical background, was Freetown reports that it has enough water for 500,000 people. And yet there's 1.5 million people that live there. So the contradiction is, where are those 1 million people getting water from? And most importantly, to what I'm interested in is how. So the reason why I think that this question is so important is because as climate change continues to happen, we all know that everything is going to get worse. Droughts are going to get worse, flooding is going to get worse. Nearly everything to do with wash is going to get worse. And not only that, but because the actual situations are going to get worse, I'm pretty confident that funding is going to be spread thin, everything's going to be harder. So we're going to have to learn to do more with less as we go along. And so who better to go to figure out how to do more with less than the people who live with these struggles every single day. And that is the foundation of my research, is figuring out what the lived experience of people can do to educate our future programs and to integrate our projects into their lives and actually build upon what's already been made and to improve our own systems and interventions. So the way that we can do this is by respecting the way that people think, embracing their innovations and understanding the systems, both physical systems, but also the social systems around water. And that's what we're gonna be talking about today. So first of all, don't want to take anything for granted. So like, where is Sierra Leone? West Africa, corner tip. You can see it right down here at the most southwest corner of West Africa. And Sierra Leone and Freetown itself is on a big rocky peninsula that we're going to talk about in a second. My two communities that I started focusing on, that I did my planned study survey in, were Dorzark and Porti Wakuba. I chose these communities specifically because Dorzark is mountainous and central, and therefore has a few more economic and connections to the city, while also being very mountainous, changing the hydrogeologic profile of the location. Porti Wakuba is seaside, so that introduces more issues of brackish water, of lower water tables, and some issues like that, but it's also very peripheral to the city, so it has less connections. I thought that these two different locations will provide a lot more ideas of what communities share and what similarities are between various locations. So the first thing to know about Freetown itself, as a city of 1.5 million people, is that it's extremely mountainous. And this was kind of the best picture I could find to show that. It is very steep, it is very rocky, and that means when rain comes, it hits the mountains and goes straight into the ocean. There are no large lakes there. There are no large above ground reservoirs. The only thing that they have for actual water resources is groundwater and streams. These are their two resources, making it very difficult to provide year-round reliable water sources to the entire population. It isn't simply a social, it is an engineering problem, and it is a social problem. And we're going to be talking mostly about the second, but I do want to address that engineering and civil engineering aspect of the problem. In addition to this, the climate, it makes it very difficult to do so as well. It's a tropical country, which almost all, I believe a lot of us have worked in. And so we know that there's only two seasons, the dry season that lasts about 8 months, and then the wet season that lasts about 4. Climate change is concentrating this a great deal. So that means when, there's very noticeable trend to making that, wet season more concentrated. It's the same amount of water, but it's all, instead of 4 months or 4.5 months or so, it's actually all coming in like 2 to 3, which means when that water comes, it comes even harder and faster and flows even quicker down into the ocean without the ability for it to be soaked into the ground and replenish so much of the water supply. More damage, less water. Things are getting even more difficult here. So why did I choose Sierra Leone? 2 reasons. One, Njala University had a great connection with my university, and that made things quite a bit easier. But also, my university has connections all around the world. I chose Sierra Leone because of SLURC as well. The Sierra Leone Urban Research Center deserves a lot of credit for helping me put this research project together. I came with the questions, and then they asked me how involved I wanted to be. They were okay if this was during COVID, so we actually were able to set up 2 plans. One where I wasn't involved at all and I was gone, and they just presented me as an Excel spreadsheet at the end. But another one where I was there every day. I was in the communities, I had interviews, I had access. They gave me everything that I needed when I showed up. I'm very lucky I got that second option because it makes all of the difference, which we'll get to. The other reason is I actually have a personal connection to Sierra Leone. My father, which you can see in the picture on the far left, I think is what it'll be, was a Peace Corps officer in Sierra Leone in the 80s, where he met a young guy named Desmond Cargoby. He was the 25th child of a chief and didn't have a lot of prospects because of that birth order. And since then, he not only take over his father's position, rising up through the ranks incredibly quickly, but he's also a national representative for all chiefs. This gives me a really, he's kind of an uncle figure for me, and I visit him every time I go back. Not only that, but I'm named after him. His name is Desmond Maye Cargoby, and mine is Brian Maye Waters. And Maye actually means chief in a local Mende language in Sierra Leone. So my name is actually Brian Chief of Waters, and I study water security in Sierra Leone. It's like you just can't beat fate and avoid what is planned out for you in the past. And the other 2 pictures are just a picture of me, my dad, and him, and then finally him in his full chief regalia at the end. But the reason why I brought this up is A, for positionality, for understanding where I'm coming from, but also understanding that I have a very human perspective on issues here. Because just like whenever I see Desmond, I see him constantly looking for more resources and juggling need, but also constantly using the social connections and the social capital around him to get what he needs, even when physical access seems impossible. So these are the strategies that I take into a lot of my work. What were my qualifications going into this? As mentioned, a Ph.D. in urban planning, which with a concentration in search and research, with concentration in informality, with a concentration in a lot of those kinds of issues. I also have a quantitative foundation in my economics, which means because honestly, that's my natural inclination. I love talking to people and learning, but I love taking that and turning it into charts, graphs, maps, and figures. And I really like that because it really influences the way that I do research overall. I don't think of myself as discovering knowledge or exploring data. I find myself to be a translator between what people already know and the people with resources, and the people with resources. So oftentimes stories may not get through to some people, but in a report or in a proposal, that data does, and that's all I'm trying to do with a lot of my research. Is try to figure out how people are living, really understand it, translating into maps and figures and statistics that people like and fund, and that's kind of my goal here. I also have 4 years of experience in Sierra Leone, going back and forth. I made quite a few trips and 2 very extended trips. And also, before I went, I read every single thing SLURC has ever published, thinking that because I wanted to know what it's like in that city. And I was very proud of that. It's a lot of research. That's why I took that picture, because I finished it. And How did this prepare me? Well, I think everybody who's done field research, especially the first time, especially if they didn't go on a existing research project or with a mentor with a lot of insight, it did not help me. And this is basically my goofy face there showing up the first day, realizing I am in trouble. Fortunately, I was joined with these guys. These are the rock stars, like they have way more expertise and way more like skills and way more knowledge than I ever will. And each one of these made this project possible. Voltage kept everything together. Jamiatu just had an answer for everything and had access to anything we needed. Aja and Jeneba had so many questions for the survey that they made sure that even the simplest questions, for example, I was measuring water in gallons like an idiot, and nobody there knows what a gallon is. And they were just the first people to be like, what is a gallon? And so we managed to change it not to liters, but to the actual local like jerry cans and 5 gallons that people use. So that way we can then later convert. Without that, this would never have worked. Musa, Baboya is hilarious, but also most importantly, he was very much an ethical person. He's by training an imam, and he was very conscious of what effect we were having on people and what these questions were doing. We changed a lot of questions because of what his inputs, realizing that they were very sensitive or offensive. And Musa was really great because he's the perfect researcher who knows exactly how to get any information out of people in the most friendly and compassionate way. And finally, Dahdaleh and Musa is the first person I take on every project now because he just knows how to make sure things happen. And Dahdaleh was the most effective and accurate surveyor out of everybody. I could not find any errors on like any of his surveys, and that is like, and I ran a lot of statistical tests on these things to make sure that it all worked out. But yeah, this is like a dream team, and I couldn't believe I got it, and it wouldn't have worked without each one of these. And I want to make sure they get the credit that they deserve. What did we find out? Well, when I showed up, I based my survey off of actually done research already and surveys, 5 or 6 surveys that real researchers had sent to me. And it was it's on paper and it's 30 pages of Word. And they showed up to me and asked me why I was being so backward and weird about this, like make it a digital survey. So I got introduced to Kobo Collect, and fortunately later I even taught myself how to code in ODK. So that way we could do live statistical testing while people were doing surveys. And that cut down a lot of the errors that we were getting. Too many zeros really throw a lot of things off, but they're very easy to test for. We were also able to take the survey from 60 minutes down to 35 minutes without really losing any interesting points, but also gaining a few useful points. For example, we're going to get to it down at the bottom. I thought there were 4 water sources, but there ended up being 12. And to test for each of those and ask questions about them really saved us a lot of headache later on. And because of this help and assistance, I was also able to go from the planned 400 surveys per season up to 600. So we ended up doing 1,209 total surveys over 9 months, and for the price of 800, because we just saved so much time that they got to do instead of 5 a day, 6 a day. And finally, we really wanted to focus on surveyor safety. As I was looking at other people's surveys and projects that was going on, I realized that they weren't taking into consideration whether or not these questions would be rude, offensive, or make people quite defensive. And that puts a lot of these people, like the surveyors themselves, in a dangerous position, especially as some of them are women and we're in these informal settlements. So it was really important to us to make sure we worded everything and simply just eliminated some of these questions that would cause danger directly to the surveyor. So what did we actually learn? And let me check my time. Looks like we're still doing all right. The main thing that we found out was that seasons matter. These are in like that just, that's a basic consideration as effective to what we were looking into as just how much water there was. To be honest, everything is clouded by season, and every result that we got basically changed from one season to another. But before we get into that too much, we have to talk about the socioeconomic. What were the kinds of people that we were talking to? Everybody lived in informal settlements, a lot of them in pretty extreme poverty. But when you walked into one of these houses, what you would find is about 6 or 7 people, half of them adults, usually, and then 1 more, and then a couple of them being kids, but almost no elders. The life expectancy in these areas are actually quite low compared to the rest of the world. But it's surprising to find that there's usually there's not necessarily multifamily, but extended family and informal relationships working together, whether that be cousins, uncles, nieces, whoever's living together. That's what accounts for so many adults in each house. As far as household expenditure, like wealth goes, the economic part of socioeconomics, What we found is every month a household spent about $324 on, total. That was kind of the household budget. We measured by expenditure because asking people how much they make is always underestimated, but this was much more reliable. But one thing that we're gonna find out, and, sorry, the biggest expense was of course food at about half of what they're spending, and water being about 5%, which is really nice, which is really good. I'm so glad we found 5% because there is that rule of thumb in a lot of water security about how much are people willing to spend for water, about 5%. It changes, of course, but 5% is kind of the rule of thumb. So I'm glad we found something very consistent with the rest of the literature. But one thing I want to point out here, and it's going to continue to be a running theme of this research, is look at the difference between the dry season and the wet season, especially when it comes to water. The amount that they're spending on water actually increases dramatically, which is strange because water is falling from the sky. Why aren't they getting a bunch of free water and spending is going down? Well, we're going to talk about that in a bit, but it's important to notice it's already starting here. The next thing that we noticed, the next thing I wanted to get more familiar with and intuitively understand is the concept of multiple sources of water being used in these informal settlements. So I asked how many sources of water I asked them how many sources of water they use, and we got a lot of descriptive statistics on those water sources. And we found in the dry season, 1 or 2 sources, generally 2, usually not necessarily a backup, but usually they have a drinking water source and then a non-drinking water source. And that's how they survive, which makes a lot of sense. And we'll talk about that when we get to sachets. But what I want to point out that's most interesting here is that you start off and that almost nobody only uses 1 water source in the wet season. And they actually go from 1 or 2 to 2 or 3 water sources. So they're diversifying their water sources in the wet season. And I'm going to show you later on, the natural assumption is good. They're just adding rainwater to their water resources. It's not necessarily true, actually. What we're starting to paint a picture of is actually the wet season is just as hard to live water-wise in these communities than the dry season, if not harder. Like just because rain is coming down does not mean their water problems are solved for 2 months. Quite the contrary. So this is a terrible chart for a presentation, and I don't want to get into it because there's just a bunch of numbers, but I did want to make sure that it was here because this is what the actual numbers look like. This is a switch from primary drinking sources from one season to another, which is a transition table. Instead, let's see what the primary drinking water source of each house actually looks like in a much more like intuitive way. Is there any way we can get the bottom to go away? I'm not sure if we can. Perfect, thank you. Excellent. So what this is a flow chart of, and this is, if I was gonna say that there's one finding or one output from this 9 months that I was working on, it's this. And what it is showing us, because this is actually, I looked it up, it is called an alluvial chart. And while some people aren't familiar, so I'm gonna go with it for just a second. What you're seeing here is basically if you're looking at like open well, you're gonna see the proportion of people who in the dry season, this brown spot, used the open wells, just hand dug wells, which was about 97 people using open wells for hand dug for their drinking water, for their primary drinking water source. Then you can see proportionally how many of those people switched to rainwater, switched to spring, which was only a very small amount. The most amount of people switched from open well to sachet, and then some others stayed from open well and stayed in open well. And then you can see the switches. So we can get into this more later if there's any questions, but I'm just going to keep moving on, and I hope that was clear for a few of you who may not have gotten this so intuitively. Fundamentally, there are 3 things that I want to point out for this. Even though I have about 6 things that I want to talk about, I will only talk about 3. The first thing is, look at the change in seasonality. If I were to go in and have done my research one time, I had a snapshot throughout the year, and then it would have told me nothing about the rest of the year. Fundamentally, there's a massive amount of change, and very little of it is actually consistent change. I don't want to go as far to say that this is chaotic because there are actually some trends that I've been finding in here having to do with wealth and economics. But fundamentally, look at the amount of change that goes from one season to another, and that is not easily defined, is extremely important to understand. Meaning, I kind of like always, whenever I read a research project on water now, I always look to see if it was a one-time survey or not, and I judge it pretty heavily, but that's just my personal thing. The second thing I want to point out is sachets. So some people, sachets, some people may not know what they are. They're small sealed bags of water. They basically look like a Ziploc bag, but they are sealed at the manufacturer source. most research that you'll read in Ghana or Nigeria will say that they're 500 milliliters. They're 400 milliliters in Sierra Leone. Not sure entirely why, but they are. And they've consistently been found to be the cleanest water sources wherever they exist. This doesn't mean that they are potable or they are safe, but that means that generally the people who have enough money to manufacture and sell these sachet waters have access to the cleanest water, which is usually municipal, and that's what they use because that's the most reliable and easiest way. That's the best way to get the most amount of water into their small manufacturing. They're machines that actually create these sachet waters. So what am I trying to say with sachet water now that I can introduce them? The important thing is that's the main drinking water source, hands down. It's not wells, it's not even the city water, it's nothing else, it's sachets. There's been a lot, whenever we were talking about it, nearly everybody uses sachet, even if they don't call it their primary water source, because it's just widely available, it's super transportable, and it's also, if you don't like the person who's selling it, you just walk another 10 feet down the street and somebody else is selling it. So there's a huge amount of choice and there's very little risk to getting it. The two downsides of sachet water is A, yes, it's plastic waste that just gets thrown into the gutter, but two, it's also roughly 30 times as expensive by volume than the rest of the sources. So that is quite expensive, even though on a per unit, even though you're just using this for drinking water. Nobody uses it to wash their clothes or anything. So sachets are super important and consistent between seasons. The second thing that I really want to point out, rainwater is not very popular. Now, this was a really confusing situation, and again, why I'm so glad that I had my surveyors all the time, because I had to ask them why rainwater isn't more popular as a drinking water source. And they said it was because of zinc poisoning. Everybody has noticed that there is a connection between rainwater and getting sick. And so people avoid it. They actually have gone, for those of you who don't know, rainwater system, especially in this location, rain comes down, lands on the roof, collected by gutters, goes into a pipe goes into a barrel, you drink from the barrel. That's how the systems work everywhere. But people are finding that they're getting very sick from it. And they believe it's because when the rain hits the rooftops, that it's dissolving pieces of the metal and increasing the heavy metal content of the water. And that's what's making them sick. That's the belief. There's almost no literature on this, especially in Sierra Leone, where people believe this. And it's definitely something that needs to be validated or dismissed, so that way this problem can be fixed. But it's especially important to look further into this, because when I was there's a huge push for rainwater catchment systems, but there's a whole social stigma against it because people know you're going to get sick from it. And so introducing new rainwater catchment systems is probably going to be initially accepted by a lot of people just because, hey, I get free stuff. But eventually, I don't believe that these are going to be sustainable. They might even be torn down for parts and used in different ways than they originally expected. So that's the second lesson. First lesson, sachets are super important. Oh, sorry. First lesson, so that was the third lesson. So the first lesson is that seasons matter, incredibly important. Sachet is incredibly important. That's number two. And number three, rainwater is not the solution in Freetown that we think it is. And I can come back to this at the end for the discussion bit, because I can look at this forever. I have been looking at this from the consumer side the entire time. And I also had 5 months in between seasons to wait. So I knew this wasn't enough information. I needed to know from the water producer's perspective. And so what that meant was going to each of the water sources, going to as many water sources as I could find and asking questions. We ended up going to we have all sorts of kinds where they're just holes in the grounds. They can be pumps, they can be broken pumps that are effectively just hole in the grounds. We also have a bunch that look like basically almost like a spring because the water table is so high. But then again, we have sachet, we have tanks, we have more holes in the ground with basic infrastructure. And then we have very large systems too, but these large systems are almost entirely outside funded and outside maintained by outside funds and not within the community itself, which is going to come into a social problem we're going to talk about in a minute. One of the things that I was very conscious of is the arrogance of just going into and interrupting people's day and asking them questions this entire time, especially after I went out to a couple of surveys and saw the effects of this and how hard it was for the surveyors. I knew if I was going to go ahead and ask these questions, bring one of the surveyors for sure, but what am I going to give back? What am I going to make it worth their time for? And so Musa actually came up with the idea of going to the disaster management committees and asking if they need any sort of information or any work done with the water sources in their community. And so these and we went to them and they said, yes, we do. They needed it for two reasons. One, during a disaster, an inventory of water sources can be very useful. And two, when they go into a meeting and either ask for funding or ask for rights or ask for better improved water sources, they need to look professional. So even if they are not actually using these, being able to come into a meeting with these, well-produced documents showing them the information on their communities nobody may even look at them, but it actually helps them quite a bit and they value it a lot. And whether or not it's true, whether or not it's right or wrong, what I found very important was that they valued it. And so that's the documents that most of you who are here in person can see right now. And that's where the maps that we'll get to later are coming from. But these are the documents that we put together from the information. And it's just a 2-page, as few words as possible. But I hope it's pretty representative of the city. And so that's how we got it. Access is, I was me and Musa, and usually a representative from the Disaster Relief Committee. And we got to go around asking who owns this, how many people are using every day, what's the availability like, what's the accessibility like. We were able to ask just about every question we could think of. But what was really nice is it wasn't necessarily that, because we worked together to figure out what were the important questions, both from an academic point of view and from a local point of view. And so some of the questions I asked, I don't understand why I needed to ask them, but that's what they wanted. And I'm sure I felt the same way, but the vast majority of things that we asked overlapped, and that was pretty great. So that ended up giving us maps that look like this. We did this in 12 communities. I'm only going to show one right now because otherwise this will go on too long. But in Dorzark, one of the communities that I worked in, there's 106 odd sources that are available to the community. Some of them are outside the borders, but people still go to them. 99 are functional. This surprised us. I thought there would be way more like broken down water sources, but the reasoning is most of them are open wells. Holes in the ground are hard to break, so they're functional. The other thing that I thought was interesting was the owners themselves reported whether these were safe to drink. And only a third of them were like, no, it's not. Don't drink from this. And I thought that was really kind of hilariously honest, but really practical because they don't really want to poison their neighbors. So they are honest about these kinds of things. But almost all of them, 87% are privately owned, not just from the government or from the community or anything. What people are doing are they're investing in these water sources themselves whenever they have extra money and then providing to the community. 70% of these water sources are just available to any stranger who comes by. We're going to get to the asterisks on all of that in a second, but it's an amazing system where individuals and households are investing in their own water systems and then serving the community. And that's kind of the fundamental answer to that question of where are people getting water and how. It's just individuals, and they're doing the best that they can. As far as water prices, water prices go, this also shocked me. 91 of the 106 sources were free. They weren't charging. Nobody was like exchanging money for this water. You come along and you say, hey, I need some water from your well, and they say, okay, and that's that. The more complicated aspect of it, because I kept asking, well, why are you doing this? What if it breaks down? What about maintenance? What about longevity of these water sources? They were very wishy-washy about it. Once we started getting to places with pumps, it was actually kind of surprising how often this is like the first time somebody had like introduced that concept to them, which I thought was very interesting. They weren't just, it doesn't really matter. But the reason why the water sources are free is not because they're not getting anything out of it or they're super generous. They're not really interested in gathering financial capital from their water sources. What they're interested in is social capital from their water sources. So what they're interested in is being the guy who, I got my water cover needs, but now my friends owe me a favor. Now that stranger who came by and asked for water owes me a favor. And now if I see him in the market or I see somebody or I need something, I need another hole dug, I need a fence put up, I need something done, I can ask favors back. And so it's all about, in these communities, it's actually all about social capital, not economic capital around the water sources. As far as the prices go, in case you need a translation for the last 15, such a minority, I'm not terribly interested in getting into it right now, but that's about 2.5 cents for a jerry can, 5 gallons. Anybody know how many liters 5 gallons is? What would that be?
15, 6, 2.78.
And just under 20 liters. Yeah, just under 20 gallons, 15 to 20 liters, would be about 2.5 cents. Or about 5 cents or up to 10 cents, is the most expensive one. So that's kind of the setting that we would see when we go in there at times of good, that when times are good, is there's just water sources, you can go get it if you want, and now you kind of owe favors because, you know, somebody helped you out. Seasonality, back to it. What we found out is we asked how available these sources were. First, that was a terrible question because people have said daily, oh, it's available from like 6 in the morning until noon. And some people were like, oh, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And then other people were like, well, it's sort of available for the first 3 months of the dry season, and then it's kind of only family only. And like, we just had to text these answers. We couldn't like put these into categories or anything. It was almost a complete disaster. But after going back and figuring this out and putting a lot of work into this, we sorted it into 4 major groups. So there's only 6 sources always available here. And I thought that was fascinating. Like fundamentally, only the biggest, best sources make it through the end of the dry season and into the wet season without getting contaminated. And that's really important, is like only 6 sources, I didn't get into it too much, but the wet season is just as bad as the end of the dry season for most people. And there's only 6 sources in the entire community available. There's 61 sources that are limited, which what we decided to define that basically as is, it was a very interpretive, and I worked with my surveyors to figure this out, but what it basically means is people don't say, no, you can't have my water. They start charging money. They start charging more money. They start yelling at you, or they start acting frustrated if you ask. They start putting up they start de-incentivizing the use of their water. They start asking for favors up front. Whatever it is that they're doing, they make life a little bit more miserable, a little bit harder, ask for more cost, because there's simply less water. Like, it's more valuable and all that. We can have an economic argument about it. But what we're saying here is like, throughout the year, as the water gets less and less available, the incentives, the water owners are trying to find like kind of like subtle ways of saying no without saying no. And this can cause a whole lot of problems and power dynamics, because the first people that they start saying no to charging or making their life miserable are generally extremely poor, are generally women that are generally women, and it gets really tough for some of these people. The drastically limited sources are the ones where they just stop offering it. They do say no. They're like, we're done. We're not offering it to anybody outside of my friends and family, and that's it. Or the quality of water from the concentration of sedimentation from lack of actual water sources gets so bad that it's just really not great water, even though it's there. And actually only 7 sources go dry. And so the 2 major takeaways from this is that only 6 are always available, and only 7 go completely dry. So if you ask if these sources are seasonal, that's not a good question to these people. Like, that doesn't make sense. And it's not accurate. It's not going to give you anything to build off of or understand. So there's a lot more to all of this. This was basically a fact-finding mission in the end, because when I showed up, as most of us do in our first field experiment, like our first questions didn't make any sense and we have to throw it all out. So I have so much data and I'm still working on the interpretation. And that's fundamentally what my PhD is about. But what I really wanted to do once I got there is finally start asking the actual question of what is your core concern around water? I started just asking people like, what are the improvements? What are the issues? What is actually going wrong? And the first thing they said was overpopulation. And I decided immediately not to touch this because overpopulation has 2 solutions. And I'm not going to talk about depopulation, and increasing like the amount of water is an engineering problem. So either side of that, not interested in necessarily. But gender-based violence was the number 2 issue. And it was so prevalent that some people didn't really even see it as an issue, but more of a fact of life. Like a super stormy rainy day, like in Canada, a super cold and blizzardy day. Like, it's just a bad thing that happens, but you just kind of muddle through. There's like a really open part of and frank part of Sierra Leonean style, of Sierra Leonean like culture that they'll just tell you. And this is a good example of that, where they're just totally open and honest that this is what happens. They'll tell you when it happened to them. They'll tell you just about anything. And the phrase that they always use is water for water. It's a very sad phrase, but fundamentally, people are saying water for water, which means sexual favor, sexual assault for the access to the water. And so one of the things that this means that I want to study is accessibility issues, because if we study this from a numerical point of view, these people have gotten access to water and they succeed. But I think it's important to dig a little deeper. And that's a lot of what I'll be studying throughout my PhD. is not just success or failure, but what does that accessibility look like? What is it? How can we improve that system? But as I said near the beginning of this presentation, I think probably, yeah, I think I said it. Yes, it did. My style of research is not about the creating and generating knowledge or gathering it. I mean, sorry, not generating or creating knowledge. It's about just translation. And so when I hear these issues, as much as I want to speak to the story and the people involved, it is my natural style to turn these things into numbers so that way we can start talking to outside people who are just more interested in their own and those indices and other measurements of success and failure. So a good example of that, and a very basic example of that right here, is this statistics. 75% of water gatherers that I interviewed were women, that from the households are women. And 75% of source owners are men. Men are controlling this means of production, basically. They are owning water sources. They are gathering money when they need it. They're getting whatever they need for just owning the water source. While women are largely doing a job that is largely thankless and absolutely required for their children and for their own intensive needs, but they get almost no prestige or reward for it in the end, except for now they have water. So there's a huge power dynamic. And one thing I want to point out about these numbers is I measured these in the dumbest way because I have no training in this. I had no training or ideas about this back then. And I simply just asked people in the households if they're water gatherers, and I didn't think about whether they go every day or twice a day or 3 times a day or once a week. And so sure, there's some of these households are men just being like, yeah, I go like once a week and help out. And they counted as a water gatherer just as much as women. So if I measured this by volume or trips, this number would go way, way up higher. The second thing is also true for the ownership of men, because men not only own more sources, but they own the bigger sources, the more expensive sources. And worst of all, and something that I'm very interested in researching is the fact when outside when outside programs and NGOs come in, they often give those sources that are the best and the most productive and the most valuable to the men who already have capital, both social and economic, meaning now you just have men with even more power and you're just reinforcing the power structure within the community, despite this being a very clearly women-centric job. And this is, sorry, now I'm just starting to use I'm starting to use weird words in a very sensitive topic, and that's because it's near the end of the presentation, but please forgive me. So I started this presentation off asking what can we learn from these communities? And I think that there's basically 5 major things to learn, although a million others. The first thing is that our interventions need to be well changed by season, and that needs to be addressed from the very inception of any water project. The second thing is that this needs to be when a water intervention is happening, it needs to be understood from both the production standpoint of how much and also the consumer standpoint of accessibility and whether or not people can get water, but also what that price they pay for that water is, what that water experience is. The next one is that fundamentally leads into the second one, that that a lot of outside interventions blindly reinforce power imbalances and power structures in communities that can be incredibly toxic and quite criminal sometimes. Also, household use versus drinking water use is important. People are willing to spend 30 times more water, even the poorest houses, on drinking water because it's just 2 sachet waters per day. And then they spend the same amount of money on the 20 to 30 liters they need for cleaning their clothes. So being able to separate those 2 sources and build systems based on that could create a lot more return on any investment. It's dangerous and contradiction it's dangerous and has a lot of caveats, but it is something that they're doing in the communities already. And finally, sachet waters are bad for the environment, but incredibly effective for both water distribution and safe water distribution. So my PhD going forward, what am I actually trying to do? I have 2 groupings of basically the same question. How do ownership models influence gender-based violence, seasonal availability, daily availability, source maintenance, water quality, and consumer access? I want to know if it's a guy or if it's a girl, if it's a group of people, if it's a committee, if it's an NGO, or if it's an outside organization owning this, and then and controlling it day to day, and what effect that actually has on what's going on the experience and quality of the water source. I also want to know how seasonality does the exact same thing on all these issues, because it's going to change based on scarcity. The gender-based violence, the ownership models, the daily availability, the source maintenance, the water quality, and consumer access is all going to change from the wet to the dry season. So I have it sorted into these 2 questions, and I have these specific targets for my questions going forward. And I think in my PhD program, I now have about 9 to 12 months to figure out exactly how that's going to establish it, work within a theoretical framework and a methodological framework. And I'm really excited to get to work on that. So in conclusion, thank you all for listening very patiently. Here's my LinkedIn and my email if you want to contact me. And if you just want to contact me for this is LinkedIn, you can also just scan that QR code. It'll take you right to my page. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, for really quickly summarizing years and many months of work here, and setting the stage really, really well for the work you want to dive into in your PhD. Now, as you can see, I have a lot of questions, and I don't want to monopolize all the time, but maybe I'll start with one, and then I invite others in the room or online to also jump in with questions if they have them. You know, my first reflection is what you've done in your master's work is draw a picture of a very complex system of relationships around water and how water interacts with the environment, with communities, with the economics, gender, power. And it evokes to me like there's a complex system that you're mapping out here. So I'm wondering, have you considered taking a complex adaptive systems approach to this work to understand what are these relationships between all these components, and then using that as an entry point to work with communities to first of all characterize the overall system, and then say if we want to change this outcome and we see how it's related to other things, what are the interventions we can imagine together and potentially implement them to see how they behave? Have you considered that?
I have not considered that particular approach. And largely because since it's water and social, there's so many approaches to take. So actually, I've been finding over the last 7 months here at York that my approaches are going to end up being defined by the connections and advisors and mentors that I find. And so if I find a mentor advisor with that angle, I am down. But right now in the geography department, my approach is largely feminist geography and political ecology.
There are certainly some people here who are working on composite adaptive systems. Nell is one, and her faculty supervisor can probably support. So I invite you to talk to Nell about how this kind of approach might work as a tool for at least characterizing the overall system.
As you can see.
You also have a lot of questions. Me too. I should have written all mine down.
Should I?
Yeah, if you want, like,
sure. You know, when you talk about water for water, I'm working in. Sorry, I always forget to do this. It was an awesome presentation.
Oh, thank
you. When the lights came on, I was like, oh,
good.
You know, it's focusing. So I'm working in Malawi, and there's a similar problem, as you mentioned, water for water, which is sex for fish. And I'm in that moment where I was just discussing with Imran, trying to figure out what I should research, you know, and which is not just safe for my participants, but also safe for me. And where we'll actually, I'm in that position where I can ask these questions going into my work. So you're interested in water for water. Have you, and you've been in Sierra Leone, have you thought about how you're gonna ask those questions about the safety of your participants, your own safety? And I'd love to pick your brain on that, because I shied away from that simply because I thought that might become too unsafe for my participants and for myself.
Yes. The number one rule that I established when I was there, and I think I mentioned it once or twice, was that I was willing to drop questions even if they were important to me because of safety to my surveyors, to the safety of that was always my top concern, because again, I saw way too many examples of surveys that clearly had never considered that and clearly had dangerous questions themselves. And so even though we get in that situation, I've heard it since coming back where people are like, oh, but what if maybe I can just push a little bit? And I'm like, honestly, it's best just to drop it. Like, just not only drop that, but drop the consideration as well, or try to find your wrangling way around it. So I have a very fast rule that I'll just drop this if that's what ends up happening. But as far as the strategy going forward, my main strategy is to take time to get to know the community better and to make connections within the community. So for example, this summer I'll be heading back for 2 months without a real research design, just to continue establishing those relationships and to be working within the community, just to be seen, so that people know who I am and what I'm doing. So hopefully they hear hear the phrase hey, it's the Water's Water Project or something like that, and they'll know who I am and what's going on. But as for the so the first thing is to establish the relationships within the communities. But the second thing that I'm going to do is heavily rely on my surveyors. Like it'll be the same research team. They're extremely like just naturally talented. They're also, oh, I forgot to mention, they are all from these communities and none of them have more than a high school education. And so like this is all just what they do. It's not even like what they're trained in. They're just extraordinarily good at this. And so what my plan is to do is to go back and negotiate that question that you're asking with them and with the communities and just be satisfied with whatever answer I get back. It is not going to be my plan or my answer or my strategy necessarily. I'm just going to have the indicators that end up linking to academia and published papers. And if they say like this is impossible, then it's impossible. If they say I can do it a different way, then I can do it in a different way. If they say, actually, no, this is fine, because like I said, it's a very frank culture that they'll just answer the questions. And that's been my experience is if I just ask a question about this and I try to be comfortable and they're just like, why are you tiptoeing around this? And they just bluntly answer and jump to the answer. So it comes down to not me having an answer, it comes down to asking them.
I mean, I could ask other questions, but if anybody else has.
We can carry this conversation on afterwards. I think there's lots of mine here as well, but just to reflect on something you were saying earlier about the background you have both in qualitative and quantitative. I think this is the real power of a mixed methods approach is that certain questions, because of the risks that they present to either the surveyor or the community respondents, may be better suited for other kinds of methods.
Yeah.
Maybe not a survey, but a key informal interview, a focus group, or some other method. That's the power of a mixed methods approach, which you're already taking. So I think that's great. See a question online from Professor Botan. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that presentation. A lot of the things you have talked about is it's a reflection of some of the findings we have made in other areas. Just to be clear on that, we've collected data from Malawi, from Ghana, from Kenya, and from Nigeria, especially informal settlements on water insecurity. And we have a good sense of some of the issues you've brought up. But since there's going to be your PhD program, I thought I should bring to mind some things you probably not looked at, or you probably looked at those, but maybe not integrated into your project. One has to do with the measurement of water insecurity. A few years back, I worked with my PI at the time at Northwestern for us to develop the household water insecurity experiences scale that span across 30 countries. And so it consists of 12 items or questions, and you have the shorter version of it. You might want to take a look at it. It could help as you develop your questions, right? Now, number two, you had talked about you taking a translational approach to your research. And so I was thinking if you had thought of co-production in terms of when it comes to intervention, it is one key approach that works in this field when it comes to water research. And we've done something like that in Malawi, but I mean, it might also work for you in Sierra Leone. And we also came up with some finding on social capital that is key. I mean, they probably will not take money, but the capital works in other areas. So I thought that was awesome. And finally, water quality. I did see that you'll be looking at water quality. I'm not sure how you intend to measure it, and I don't intend to put you on the spot, but currently we are running a bacteriological study. It's just about to start in Ghana, where we are looking at sources of water, and we are assessing coliform bacteria. We are assessing the presence of fecal matter. And then we want to assess what health effects are associated with those. I'm throwing it out there just in case at some point you need input into it. I'm happy to help. So thanks for that presentation.
Thank you very much. I think the major thing to respond back to you is because that is only that last bit about measuring water quality. That's something I'm interested in doing, but absolutely not alone. There's just too much other parts of this project. So I am kind of keeping eyes out for partnerships on people more interested in the health and water quality aspects, just to develop partnerships. But yeah, because I'm just being practical I'm trying to be as practical as I can, both in my research approach and in the amount of research to be done. But yeah, excellent points. And I've taken some notes of these things. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Goting, for those really, really great reflections on the presentation. If there are any other questions online, please feel free to raise your hand. I see Hillary has raised her hand. Go ahead.
Hello, hi Brian. This was great. Thank you so much. And it was cool to see from an informal chat to a presentation, like all the connections. So thank you. I was just curious if you could elaborate a bit more in the couple minutes you have left about that really cool chart you have. I forget what you call it, one with the flows between the dry and the wet season, and it shows changes of on the consumer side. Like any kind of intervening variables or causal mechanisms that you kind of read into that data, because you have the dry and the wet, which is clearly something about the actual availability of water is what's causing a shift. But I'm wondering within that shift, what are some, from observations you've made or from other analysis you've done, socioeconomic or water quality or location, what might explain a shift maybe from to sachets or to NOD or does that make sense as a question?
Yes, it does. I would love to get into a lot of these, and give me 1 second while I find something. Do you mind if I can't share my screen anymore. There's just something about pausing, so I'm not sure. Can I share screen? Great. So you're talking about this. Sure,
Yeah.
So the thing I see about this is it is a tangled mess. So there is no large scale things. But what I've been finding success in is picking pieces of it out, looking at a single source at a time rather than as a whole. And a really good example of that is sachet water. When I take out the sachet water, I wish I could quickly find that chart. Let me actually open it. Yeah, we've got 3 minutes. So if I can find it real fast, it'll actually help quite a bit here. Formatted tables. Cool, it is this one. So let me zoom in. Let me see if I can't zoom in pretty tight on this. So this is the same thing, and it's an alluvial chart, apparently. That's the technical word for it. I looked it up this morning to remind what it is, but it's an alluvial chart. And so one of the cool things is when I look at this from the wet season to the dry season of sachet, what I actually find really interesting is that there's a third of the population that doesn't use sachet, and a third of the population that does use sachet, and then like a third of the population that switches perfectly. So almost perfectly. So what I'm actually seeing here is if you look at this from a production standpoint, for some odd reason, it's very reliable. You have the same amount of customers in both seasons. But if you're looking at this from a customer perspective, there's some sort of reason why people have the need to switch from sachet water to other sources in the wet season, maybe to rainwater, maybe to whatever. I'm not really sure because they can save money. But there's also a third that have their other sources that they decide, I'm going to switch to sachet, even though it's the rainy season. So looking at things like this can help us understand, especially sachets, which I think are going to continue expanding throughout the global south just because of its practicality. It'll help us understand how to use sachets in a clever and more clever way to target consumers of water. But like, it's really hard to come out with something at this point just to say this is the effect and this is the lesson to learn. But it gets even weirder, but like more straightforward when we start looking at sources in isolation. And this is a really good example of this, where like it is a third, and then that third that switches is exactly mirrored. And I'm not sure why, but I'm gonna go try to figure it out. And that's kind of, I think, as far as I can go with that question right now.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's really interesting and the visual is very effective. So thanks for sharing.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, we have about 1 or 2 minutes left, so yeah, we can take one last brief question.
Sure, in terms of the sachets, who are making these sachets? Like, who's producing these?
Oh, this is super cool because it's like large households that are that are a little bit wealthier, relatively wealthy, and can afford a very large machine that goes into their like house or like an outhouse kind of area. But it's like a machine that might be about the size of this room. I get to see one, but I've heard it because it's very loud and they run them in the evenings sometimes. But it can be a room about this big and it's a machine that fills it up and it's very loud. And what you can do is you can buy them. And from what I understand, they're actually like they're like buying a tractor for a farm, huge expense, but like there's a lot of uses and it's usually it's almost super, it's both, the cool thing about it is that those machines are both like very financially feasible, because of like, as long as you can get that investment, you'll make your money back almost guaranteed, but also not that hard to operate apparently. I need to do a lot more looking into it, but to answer your question is like individual wealthy households, but not like wealthy, like they're the rich man around, they just can actually have access to it, and they find this to be a very good business model. And it's a really cool thing. One of the things that I hate most about what Freetown is doing right now is a lot of government people are starting to realize how profitable it is. And so they're starting to jump into competition with these people and they're clearly gonna win. But the interesting part about this is if you don't do that, you have a very decentralized structure of water production that is very reliable and very safe. And that to me sounds way better than 1 or 2 monopolies within this, with a monopoly or duopoly in the city. And that can be very cool, but it'll go where it goes.
It's quite interesting. You said it's the cleanest water available, so I guess most of it is coming from bore wells, nothing open,
It
no?
almost always comes from the city water.
Oh.
Yeah. It is usually just like you plug it into the city, your tap, probably a bigger tap than normal, but that's almost how all of them are run, not off of actual boreholes. Some of them are run off boreholes for sure, because you can just plug it into anything.
Someone sounds like the Nestle effect.
Sure, but not
Water.
to do, but yeah, but in a site, but I don't know, like I agree, but it's not a monopoly. It's not one guy in charge of everything. It's people
But
in the communities.
group of the population, you know.
And that would be a fantastic analysis. There's actually a sachet water literature, but only about 70 academic papers that I've been able to find, and then it stops.
Research thesis.
Yeah.
You want to share?
Tell Justin Stoller to get back on it.
It's a big question about how to get water to people in that last mile of supply. And the point that Nell is raising is that this is a public supply that's being basically privatized, but in a decentralized, accessible manner.
Yes.
So this is one potential model of expanding supply, but there are many others as well. So we're past time. I want to thank you so much, Brian, for a really, really fantastic presentation. I want to thank everybody in the room for joining us and online as well. Look forward to welcoming you all to the next session, which will be on Wednesday, January 31st. We're going to have a presentation entitled Voices from the Land, Inuit Perspectives on Tradition, Change, and the Future. This is put on by the Wellness Impact Lab and Connected North. Please visit the websites, DHHR/events for more information. And with that, I would like to now close the session. Thank you all for being here. See you next time.
Thank you all.